There is a document that survived the fall of Rome. Not a battle record. Not an imperial decree. A calendar. The kind of practical object a wealthy Roman household would keep to track festivals, religious observances, and the rhythm of the civic year. Scholars call it the chronograph of 354, and it sits quietly in the history of this argument as one of the few pieces of primary evidence that everyone involved tends to either misread or ignore. In one section of this document, a celebration called the Natalis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered, is recorded on the 25th of December. In another section of the same document, the Roman Christian calendar records the birth of Jesus on the 25th of December. Same document. Same city. Same century. Two religious traditions. One date. Most people who encounter this fact ask the wrong question. They ask which one came first. Assuming the answer will settle something. It does not settle anything. Because the question itself is pointed in the wrong direction. The more interesting question is, what happened afterward? One of those traditions grew into the largest religious institution in human history. The other became something you can only visit by paying an entrance fee and walking down 2 flights of stairs into the dark. Mithras is at the center of that story, but not in the way most people think. Here is something worth knowing before anything else about this subject. The popular argument connecting Mithras to Christmas moves in a straight line. Mithras had a birthday on December 25th. The early church assigned Jesus that same birthday. Therefore, Christmas was copied from Mithras. The argument sounds clean, and it travels fast, which is exactly why it has spread as far as it has. The problem is that the straight line does not exist in the actual evidence. It exists in an assumption. And the assumption collapses the moment you separate 3 figures that almost every popular account treats as one. The first is Mithras, a deity at the center of a mystery cult that spread across the Roman Empire from Britain to the eastern provinces. The surviving evidence suggests a predominantly male initiatory cult, organized around 7 grades of membership documented in inscriptions found across the empire. Gatherings took place in underground temples called Mithraea, deliberately built to resemble caves. The image most closely associated with Roman Mithraism is the tauroctony, showing Mithras killing a bull, surrounded by a consistent set of figures, a dog and a snake moving toward the wound, a scorpion gripping the bull from below, stalks of grain emerging from the tail, the sun and the moon watching from the upper corners of the scene. This image was carved in stone and often placed at the focal point of the Mithraeum. No ancient text explains what it meant. The second is Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. This was the official sun deity of the Roman imperial cult, elevated to particular prominence by the Emperor Aurelian in the year 274. Sol Invictus had a public temple in Rome. He had state festivals and formal state recognition. He was not a mystery cult figure operating in underground rooms. He was part of the official public religion of the empire, visible and politically sanctioned in ways that Mithras was not. The third is Invictus in the calendar. When the chronograph of 354 records the Natalis Invicti on December 25th, it is most likely referring to Sol Invictus in the context of the civic calendar. It is not automatically referring to Mithras. The 2 figures share symbolic territory around solar imagery and the title of the unconquered. But they are not the same entity and should not be treated as one. The straight line from Mithras to December 25th to Christmas runs directly through that confusion. It assumes that Invictus in the calendar means Mithras, which means the birthday of the solar figure means the birthday of Mithras, which means Christmas inherited that date from Mithras. Every step is an assumption. none of them are established by primary sources. There is no ancient Mithraic text recording a birthday celebration for Mithras on December 25th. There is no inscription in any Mithraea across the empire that connects Mithras to that specific date. The connection exists only in the interpretive tradition, in scholars and writers inferring it from the symbolic association between Mithras and solar imagery. That inference may be reasonable in some limited form, but it is not the same thing as evidence. And treating it as evidence is where the popular argument goes wrong at its foundation. Now here is where it becomes more complicated than the simple version allows. Some scholars have argued that the Christian tradition of marking December 25th as the birth of Jesus may predate Constantine entirely. There are texts associated with Hippolytus, writing in the early part of the 3rd century, that some historians read as placing that date within a broader chronological calculation about the life of Jesus. The textual arguments around these documents are genuinely contested among specialists, and no clean resolution exists. What this means is that the model most people carry, the idea that Constantine chose December 25th as a political strategy to absorb solar worship into Christianity, has no direct documentary support. There is no edict. There is no council record that says this. There is no document in which any emperor or church official states that the date was chosen to replace anything. What there is instead is a convergence. In the Roman world of the 1st through 4th centuries, the period just after the winter solstice carried a weight that multiple communities felt independently. The days had been getting shorter. Then, around the solstice, something shifted. The light began to come back. That movement from darkness toward the return of the sun was not something any single religion owned. It was a feature of the sky that everyone in the empire lived under. And multiple communities in the same city reached for the same moment and attached meaning to it, without requiring any of them to have borrowed it from the others. The straight line does not exist in the evidence. What exists is a convergence. And a convergence is a more interesting and more honest place to begin. Most of what you have read or watched about Mithras on the internet is wrong, not slightly off. Not a matter of interpretation where reasonable people disagree. Wrong in ways that are easy to verify and hard to excuse. Because the corrections have been available in serious scholarship for decades. The popular version of Mithras, the one used to argue that Christianity borrowed from him wholesale, is a figure assembled from pieces that do not belong to him. Here is what the archaeological record actually shows. Roman Mithraism was a mystery cult. That word does not mean mysterious in the casual sense. It means a religious tradition organized around initiation, with knowledge and practices reserved for members who had passed through specific ritual stages. The 7 grades of initiation are documented in inscriptions. The community gatherings happened in Mithraea, underground rooms built to hold specific groups rather than public congregations. The distribution of these temples across the empire, concentrated along military frontiers and in port cities, tells you something about who joined. Soldiers, to merchant, administrators, men whose lives involved movement through the infrastructure of the empire, not a mass popular religion reaching every household. A specific kind of community with a specific kind of appeal. The image most closely associated with Roman Mithraism is the tauroctony, Mithras killing a bull, with a dog and snake moving toward the wound. A scorpion below, grain from the tail, and the figures of the sun and moon watching from above. This scene was carved into stone and often placed at the focal point of the gathering space. Initiates looked at it during their rituals. We do not have a single surviving text that explains what it represented to the people who worshipped in front of it. That absence is the most important fact about Roman Mithraism. and it shapes everything else we can honestly say about the cult. One outside observer who left testimony worth examining is Justin Martyr, a Christian writer of the 2nd century. He noted that a Mithraic ritual involved bread and a cup of water, and he explained this resemblance to Christian practice by arguing that demons had imitated the Christian Eucharist in advance to deceive people. Justin was not a neutral witness. He was making a theological argument in a formal defense of Christianity addressed to Roman authorities. But his observation matters for one specific reason. He saw enough similarity between the two practices to feel it required explanation. That is evidence of perception. It is not evidence of origin. And the difference between those two things is the entire point. Now, here is the part that most accounts of this subject get completely wrong. The popular version of Mithras used in arguments about Christian borrowing includes details that have no support in any Mithraic source ever recovered. Mithras, born of a virgin. This claim appears nowhere in the archaeological record of Roman Mithraism. There is a documented motif of Mithras emerging from a rock, which appears in Mithraic art. But this is not a virgin birth narrative in any meaningful sense, and should not be described as one. Mithras had 12 disciples. There is no source for this claim. None. Mithras was crucified and rose from the dead. There is no source for this either. The Tauroctony shows Mithras killing a bull. It does not show Mithras dying. It does not show Mithras rising. No inscription. No relief. No text in the entire Mithraic archaeological record contains anything resembling a death and resurrection of Mithras. Mithras was born on December 25th. As the previous section established, this rests entirely on an inference from solar symbolism and an unestablished equation between Mithras and the Invictus of the Roman civic calendar. It is not a documented fact about the cult. These details entered the popular account primarily through 19th and early 20th century writers, working with incomplete evidence and interpretive frameworks that later scholarship significantly revised. They have been repeated from book to book and video to video until repetition itself came to look like verification. It did not. The honest version of Mithras is already genuinely interesting. A mystery cult of striking visual power, spread across an empire, leaving behind many underground temples and a central image that serious scholars still cannot fully decode after more than a century of study. The invented details do not make that story more compelling. They make it less honest. And they replace something genuinely strange with a checklist designed to serve a conclusion that was already decided before the evidence was consulted. What we do not know about Mithras is as significant as what we do know. The gap between those two things is where the most interesting questions actually live. And that gap is exactly where the next part of this story begins. Here is something that the scholars who know Mithraism best tend to say, and that almost nobody making videos about it wants to hear. The people most familiar with the actual Mithraic evidence are consistently the most cautious about the popular claims made on Mithraism's behalf. This is not because they are defending Christianity. The most careful specialists in Roman Mithraism are not religious apologists. They are historians and archaeologists who have spent careers with the physical evidence. And what the physical evidence has taught them, more than anything else, is restraint. That observation changes how you should read everything that follows. There are real points of contact between Roman Mithraism and early Christianity, not the invented ones from the checklist in the previous section. Real owns, supported by actual evidence. The question is what they actually tell us. And the answer turns out to be different from what either side wants to hear. Start with Justin Martyr, because he is the most direct primary source available for this comparison. Justin was writing around the middle of the 2nd century, within living memory of the period when both traditions were present in the same Roman cities. He described a Mithraic ritual using bread and a cup of water. He recognized enough similarity to Christian practice that he addressed it formally in a work intended to defend Christianity to Roman authorities. His explanation, that demons had created a counterfeit in advance, is theologically motivated and cannot be taken as neutral testimony. But the observation underneath the explanation is real. A second-century Christian writer, writing carefully and publicly, saw a parallel and felt it required a response. That is evidence of perception at a specific historical moment. It tells us that someone living inside one tradition looked at the other and saw something familiar. It does not tell us which tradition was the source and which was the reflection, or whether either of those framings is even the right way to ask the question. The use of water in ritual contexts is another area where both traditions had something, though precision matters here. There is evidence for water being used in Mithraic initiatory or purification contexts, suggested by physical arrangements found in some Mithraea and by ancient testimony. Calling this baptism in the Christian sense would be inaccurate, because baptism carries specific theological content in Christianity that cannot be projected onto Mithraism without evidence we do not have. What can honestly be said is that both traditions used water in contexts connected to ritual entry or purification, and that this practice was widespread across many religious communities in the Roman world, not distinctive to either of these two traditions alone. Then there is the tauroctony. And this is where the restraint, the specialist's practice, becomes most visible and most important. The image most closely associated with Roman Mithraism has resisted definitive interpretation despite more than a century of serious scholarly attention. David Ulansey proposed in a widely read study that the scene is an astronomical map, with the figures corresponding to constellations along the ancient celestial equator, and the killing of the bull representing a cosmic event tied to the precession of the equinoxes. Roger Beck, who spent much of his career examining the cosmological dimensions of Roman Mithraism, approached the astronomical question through his own analytical framework and reached different conclusions than Ulansey on several critical points. Here is what matters most about that disagreement. Neither Ulansey nor Beck supports the reading that the tauroctony represents a sacrificial death and resurrection parallel to Christian theology. That interpretation is not something either of them derived from the Mithraic evidence. It is carried into the evidence by people who arrived already knowing what they needed the image to mean. The real points of contact between the two traditions point towards something more interesting than borrowing. Mithraism and early Christianity were not mirror images competing for exactly the same audience. The surviving evidence suggests a predominantly male initiatory cult organized in small groups, without apparent mechanisms for mass recruitment or conversion. Early Christianity included women from its earliest documented period, organized around households, and spread through networks that crossed social boundaries. The Mithraic grade structure made difficult to cross. The two traditions coexisted in the same Roman cities, drew from some of the same symbolic vocabulary around light and sacrifice and communal meals, and were almost certainly aware of each other, but they were drawing from a shared world, not from each other. In the Roman religious environment of the 1st through 4th centuries, multiple traditions were responding to the same human questions about meaning, mortality, community, and what lies beyond ordinary experience. The parallels between them exist because those questions were real, and the symbolic resources available to answer them were shared across the culture. That explanation is less dramatic than a story about borrowing and theft. It is also what the evidence can actually support, and it leads directly to the question of what happened when that shared world began to change. In the autumn of 312, a Roman general marched on the city of Rome. His name was Constantine. He was one of several men competing for control of the Western Empire after a period of political fracture that had left the question of succession genuinely unresolved. His opponent, Maxentius, held Rome and had the larger force. By most calculations available at the time, Constantine should have lost. He did not lose. At a bridge over the Tiber called the Milvian Bridge, Constantine's forces defeated Maxentius decisively. Maxentius drowned in the river during the retreat. Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed ruler of the Western Empire. And what followed would reshape the religious landscape of the ancient world in ways that are still physically present in the city today. The following year, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued what historians commonly call the Edict of Milan. It established a policy of religious tolerance across the empire, ending the official persecution of Christians and restoring property that had been taken from Christian communities. This was not a declaration that Christianity was the official religion of Rome. It was a declaration that Christianity was now legal, now protected, no longer subject to state violence. The full transformation came later and under a different emperor. In the year 380, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which established Nicene Christianity as the form of religious practice the empire would officially support and recognize. This is the moment historians point to when describing Christianity's shift toward state religion, though the reality extended well beyond a single edict, with conflicts and legal adjustments continuing for decades afterward, within roughly 70 years, from the early part of the 4th century to the late part of it. Christianity moved from a persecuted minority to the officially supported tradition of the largest political structure in the Western world. Mithraism moved in the opposite direction during the same period. The Mithraea that had been active across the empire began to close. Some were abandoned and left to decay. Others were deliberately destroyed. Many were built over. The physical evidence of this transition survives in a form that is unusually direct and unusually visible, even now. Below the medieval streets of Rome, beneath the Church of San Clemente, there are layers that tell this story better than any text. The Basilica of San Clemente, standing today, dates to the 12th century. Below it is an earlier church from the 4th century. Below that is a complex of Roman structures from the 1st century. And within that complex is a Mithraeum. The altar where Mithras was worshipped is still there. The stone benches where initiates reclined during their ritual meals are still there. The room is small, as Mithraea typically were, built for a specific community rather than a public gathering. Above it, in the literal, physical sense, stands a Christian basilica that has been in continuous use for over 1,000 years. Any visitor to Rome can verify this today by paying the entrance fee and walking down 2 flights of stairs. The Mithraeum is not a reconstruction or an exhibit. It is the actual space, still in its original location, with its original fittings, sitting in the dark beneath the floor of the church that replaced the community that once used it. What that physical fact means requires care. One reading is that the construction of a church above a Mithraeum was a deliberate statement, a declaration in stone and mortar that the older tradition had been superseded and its space claimed by a newer one. That reading has force, and it fits a certain narrative about conscious religious replacement. But archaeology establishes what happened, not why it happened. Not every Christian structure built on a previously pagan site was placed there as a theological statement. Practical reasons could include the availability of existing stone and foundation work, a location already known to the community, a site that had become available when its previous users disappeared. San Clemente can be read as a statement of triumph. The evidence does not allow it to be proven as one. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. What can be said without qualification is this: Mithraism did not survive the transition to a Christianized empire. The reasons were almost certainly multiple. The restriction of the cult to men limited its capacity for growth in ways that Christianity's broader inclusion did not face. The mystery structure made expansion difficult by design. The networks of military and administrative men who had sustained the cult were themselves transformed by the changing empire, and the shift in imperial patronage meant that the environment, which had made Mithraism viable, was gone. There is no document showing that Constantine, or any emperor, chose December 25th as a Christian observance in order to replace a Mithraic or solar celebration. That claim requires a decision and a document recording that decision. Neither exists in the historical record. What exists instead is something more honest and more unsettling than a conspiracy. Two communities in the same city marked the same date as significant. One of them accumulated the property, the legal standing, the imperial support, and the institutional continuity to keep telling its story across 16 centuries. The other became a room in the dark, below the floor of the building that came after it, accessible today to anyone willing to pay and descend. The date did not decide that outcome. The question of what did is where this story is actually going. Here is a detail that almost never appears in popular accounts of this subject, and it changes how the entire scholarly conversation should be understood. Two of the scholars most associated with serious cosmological and astronomical readings of Roman Mithraism, David Ulansey and Roger Beck, both explicitly reject the claim that the tauroctony represents a death and resurrection parallel to Christian theology. Not cautiously, not with qualifications. They reject it because the Mithraic evidence does not support it. And they have spent their careers with that evidence. That fact should appear at the beginning of every video and every article that uses Mithraism to argue about Christianity. It almost never does. To understand why that matters, it helps to know where the modern study of Roman Mithraism actually began and what happened to it. In 1894, a Belgian scholar named Frans Koeman published the first volume of what would become the foundational modern study of the cult. Koeman's argument was ambitious and, for its time, genuinely original. He proposed that Roman Mithraism was essentially a Western extension of ancient Iranian religion, that the cult of Mithra documented in the Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, had traveled westward through the Hellenistic world and arrived in Rome, carrying its Iranian identity largely intact. On his reading, Roman Mithras and Iranian Mithra were versions of the same deity, and the theology of the Roman cult could be partly reconstructed by reading backward through the older Iranian sources. This framework dominated scholarship for most of the 20th century. It also quietly provided the foundation for many of the popular comparisons between Mithraism and Christianity. Because if Roman Mithraism descended directly from a tradition stretching back centuries before Christianity, then the parallels between the two could be read as evidence that Christianity had borrowed from something older and deeper. The problem is that Koeman's framework did not hold up when specialists looked at it directly, beginning in the 1970s. A generation of scholars began systematically examining what the Iranian connection actually consisted of. The most significant early challenge came from John Hinnels, who organized a conference in 1971 that brought together specialists to examine the evidence for continuity between Iranian Mithra and Roman Mithras. What emerged from that examination was a problem that Koeman's framework could not absorb: the specific elements that defined Roman Mithraism, the tauroctony, the 7 grades of initiation, the underground temples, the particular arrangement of figures in the cult image, had no clear parallels in the Iranian sources. If Roman Mithraism had descended from Iranian religion, the transmission had transformed it so completely that the two shared a name and some broad symbolic territory, but very little else that could be traced with confidence. This opened the central question that serious Mithraic scholarship has been working on ever since. If Roman Mithraism was not simply Iranian religion transplanted westward, what was it? David Ulansey proposed one of the most discussed answers. Working from the iconography of the Tauroctony, he argued that the scene was an astronomical map. The bull represents the constellation Taurus, as it was positioned on the celestial equator in an earlier astronomical age. The other figures in the scene, the dog, the snake, the scorpion, the crow, correspond to other constellations along that ancient equator. The killing of the bull represents the moment when the precession of the equinoxes caused Taurus to be replaced by Aries as the constellation of the spring equinox. Mithras, in this reading, was associated with the cosmic force behind that shift. The argument was original and generated serious engagement across the field. Roger Beck engaged with the precession hypothesis in detail across multiple studies and reached different conclusions than Ulansey on several points that matter for how the Tauroctony should be read. Beck agreed that cosmological thinking was central to the cult. He did not agree that Ulansey's specific astronomical map was the correct reconstruction. Their disagreement is not a minor technical dispute about details. It reflects a genuine uncertainty about the most fundamental question you can ask about Roman Mithraism, which is what the people who built those underground rooms and carved that image into stone actually believed they were looking at. And yet, despite their significant disagreement with each other, Ulansey and Beck agree on the point that matters most for this video. Neither of them supports the claim that the Tauroctony represents a sacrificial death and resurrection parallel to Christian theology. That interpretation arrives from outside the evidence, carried in by people who need it to be there. Here is what remains when you follow the scholarship honestly. A cult that spread across an empire, motivated people to construct underground rooms from Britain to Syria, placed the same complex scene at the center of each one, organized itself around 7 grades of initiation whose content we cannot recover, shared bread and water in rituals that a contemporary Christian writer found close enough to his own practice to require explanation, and then disappeared so completely that the scholars who have studied it most carefully still disagree about what it fundamentally believed. The history we can responsibly tell about Roman Mithraism requires attention to what the sources say and honesty about what they do not. That version of the story is stranger and more genuinely puzzling than the version where Mithras is simply an earlier draft of Jesus. It is also the version the evidence can actually support. What happened to that evidence? And to the community that produced it? Connects this scholarly disagreement to the mechanism that Thomas Paine spent his life trying to name. There are 2 ways to get this subject completely wrong, and the striking thing is how perfectly they mirror each other. The first is to walk into the evidence already carrying a conclusion. You know before you start what you need Mithras to be. You need him to have been born on December 25th, to have had 12 disciples, to have died and risen again. The details that fit your conclusion go into the argument. The details that do not fit get left out, minimized, or quietly set aside. When someone points out that a specific claim has no source, the response is to shift to a different claim. No single piece of evidence ever gets examined carefully on its own terms, because the goal was never to understand Mithras. The goal was to use Mithras to establish something about Christianity. The evidence becomes a prop for a verdict that was already written. The second way is to deny everything. Any parallel between Mithraism and early Christianity, regardless of how well documented, gets treated as an attack rather than a historical observation. Justin Martyr, a 2nd-century Christian writer who saw enough similarity between Mithraic ritual and Christian practice to address it formally in a defense of Christianity addressed to Roman authorities, becomes inconvenient. His testimony gets minimized or reframed. The position ends up requiring you to dismiss what a source from inside the Christian tradition itself recorded, which is a strange way to defend that tradition. Both of these approaches share the same structure underneath. The conclusion arrived before the evidence did. The evidence was then sorted into what confirms the conclusion and what threatens it. Anything threatening gets handled. The question that should be driving the whole inquiry, what does the evidence actually show, never gets asked in good faith, because it was never the real question. Thomas Paine recognized this mechanism and wrote about it in a way that has not aged, in The Age of Reason, published in 1794. Paine was not writing about Mithras. He was writing about something larger, about the structure of how certain claims get protected from the kind of examination that honest inquiry requires. His central observation was not about the content of any particular doctrine. It was about the conditions under which questions can and cannot be asked. His question was this: when you find a claim that cannot be examined without social cost, when asking for evidence is treated as evidence of bad faith, when the person who wants to verify is made to feel that wanting to verify is itself the problem, what are you actually looking at? You are not looking at a claim that has been tested and found true. You are looking at a claim that has been insulated from testing. Those are two entirely different situations. And the difference between them is not visible from inside the claim itself. Look at both failure modes through that lens, and something becomes clear. The debunking approach insulates its claims by making careful skepticism feel like religious defense. If you ask whether Mithras was actually born on December 25th, and note that no direct evidence supports this, the response is often that you are protecting Christianity. The social cost of asking the question carefully is being associated with the side you appear to be defending. So the question stops being asked carefully. The claims keep moving, unexamined, from one video to the next. And the movement itself comes to look like confirmation. The defending approach insulates its claims by making historical acknowledgement feel like theological surrender. If you note that Justin Martyr observed a parallel between Mithraic and Christian ritual and felt it required explanation, the response is often that you are attacking the faith. The social cost of acknowledging what the sources actually say is being seen as hostile to the tradition. So the sources stop being read straight. The tradition gets defended not by engaging with what the evidence shows, but by treating the evidence itself as the threat. Paine paid a significant price for naming this mechanism in his own time. The Age of Reason was not an argument against God. It opened with a direct statement of belief in God, placed on the first page, before any argument, before any criticism of any institution. It was an argument against the practice of making questions expensive to ask, against the social machinery that converts honest inquiry into an act of disloyalty. The response it received was not primarily a theological refutation, it was a social verdict. He was labeled an atheist by people who had not read the first sentence of the book they were condemning. The label did not need to be accurate. It only needed to arrive before the page did. That is the mechanism. It operates on both sides of the argument about Mithras and Christmas with the same efficiency, and it works for the same reason. In both cases, the question of what the evidence actually shows has been replaced by the question of which side you are on. Once that substitution happens, honest inquiry does not just become difficult. It becomes socially illegible. It starts to look like taking a side when it is actually just trying to read carefully. There is a way through this. And it is not complicated even when it is not easy. When you encounter a claim about Mithras and Christianity, ask one question before you accept or reject it. Is the person making this claim willing to say something that does not serve their position? Are they willing to acknowledge the evidence that complicates their argument? Are they willing to tell you when the sources do not support what they are saying? If the answer is no, you are not watching an analysis of the evidence. You are watching someone use the evidence as a prop for a conclusion they reached before they started looking. That is what Paine was defending: the right to notice. Not the right to be irreligious. The right to look at what is actually in front of you and say what you see, without the cost of saying it, becoming the reason not to say it at all. Here is what the evidence allows. And here is where it runs out. We cannot establish that Mithras was born on December 25th. We cannot establish that the Christian observance of that date was chosen to replace a Mithraic or solar celebration. We cannot establish that the parallels between the two traditions came from one borrowing from the other, rather than from both drawing on a shared symbolic world. Those are the limits of what the surviving sources support. And stating them is not a concession to either side. It is just an accurate description of what the evidence shows and what it does not. What the evidence does allow is something worth sitting with longer than most accounts give it. In the Roman world of the 1st through 4th centuries, multiple religious communities were working with a shared inventory of symbols. Light returning after the longest night. A sacred meal shared among those who belonged. Water marking the boundary between outside and inside. The moment just after the winter solstice, when darkness has reached its furthest point and the sun begins its return, as a threshold worth gathering around. None of these elements belong to any single tradition. They were available across the religious world of the empire. Responses to the same experiences in the same physical environment under the same sky. Think of it this way. In the city of Rome, in the 3rd century, a soldier initiated into Mithraism and a merchant who had joined a Christian community might have lived on the same street, passed the same temples, marked the same turn in the year, with different words and different rituals pointing toward the same movement of light. Neither of them needed to have borrowed anything from the other. They were both responding to the same world. When different communities reach for the same symbols independently, it does not mean that one copied the other. It means the symbols were doing something real for human beings, living in particular conditions, and that the conditions were shared across traditions, across social boundaries, across the empire itself. What changed this picture was not theology. It was the slow movement of power across the 4th century. When imperial patronage shifted toward Christianity, the landscape of religious memory began to change, not through a single dramatic decision, through the accumulation of what was funded, what was legally protected, what was built in stone, and what was allowed to fall into disuse, what was actively maintained, and what was sealed below the floor of the building that came after it. This is how religious memory works when the conditions that sustained it change. And it is a pattern that appears across human history in every tradition and every period. Not as a verdict on any of them, but as a description of how the record we inherit came to look the way it does. The tradition that accumulated public institutions, legal recognition, open community, and sustained patronage across generations kept being told. The story that had buildings got remembered. The story that had underground rooms and little surviving doctrine became archaeology. The Mithraeum under San Clemente did not become a basement because someone decided Mithraism was false. It became a basement because the community that had used it lost the network of support that had kept it alive. And the community that followed built upward rather than preserving what was below. The physical result is a Christian basilica above a Mithraic altar. Both are still there. One has been in continuous use for over 1,000 years. The other receives visitors who pay to descend. That image is not a verdict about which tradition was right. It is a document about how memory works when power moves. And the room where that document sits most clearly is still down there, waiting, at the bottom of those stairs. Go to Rome. Find the Church of San Clemente, a few minutes east of the Colosseum. Pay the entrance fee. Walk through the 12th century basilica with its mosaics and its columns. Pass the nave and the altar to the stairs that go down. Below the medieval church is a 4th century church. Below that is a complex of Roman structures from the 1st century. And in those structures, in a room that has not seen daylight since the community that used it ceased to exist, is the Mithraism. The stone altar is still there. The benches where initiates reclined during their ritual meals are still there. The room is small. It was built for a specific group of people who gathered here in the dark to participate in something they never fully explained to the outside world. Above them, in the literal physical sense, is a Christian basilica that has been in continuous use for over 1,000 years. The people who built the room below carved images we still cannot fully interpret. They left no explanation of what Mithras meant to them, no account of what they believed happened in their rituals, no text that tells us what they thought about December 25th, or whether the question would have made sense to them at all. They gathered in the dark, shared bread and water, moved through their 7 grades, looked at the image of a man killing a bull with a dog and a snake and a scorpion, and the sun and the moon, all present in the scene, and found in that image something worth building rooms across an entire empire to preserve. We do not know what it was. That is not a comfortable place to arrive. It does not give you the clean resolution that most content on this subject is designed to deliver. It does not tell you that Christmas was stolen from Mithras, because the evidence does not support that. It does not tell you that the two traditions had nothing in common, because Justin Martyr and the physical record both say otherwise. It does not resolve the question of December 25th, because that question may not be resolvable with what has survived. What it gives you instead is something more durable than a clean answer. The same moment in the year, the return of light after the longest night, mattered to people who gathered in underground rooms and to people who would eventually fill cathedrals. Both groups were responding to the same feature of the world they lived in, the same movement from darkness back toward light, with practices and images and communal meals that took that movement seriously. What they believed about it differed in ways that mattered enormously to them, and that led to entirely different histories. But the impulse to mark the moment when the darkness begins to give way was not something either of them had to borrow from the other. The Mithraism is still there, under the church, in the dark. The question of what connected those two communities to the same date, in the same city, in the same century, is still open. And the question of who gets to decide which of their stories deserves to be remembered, and which one becomes the room that tourists pay to visit, is the question that was never really about December 25th at all.